Hello everyone, my name is Tsuki, and today I'm doing a video that I've been wanting to do for a little while now, but I felt like I didn't have the proper qualifications until just recently. A little while ago, I finally accomplished getting every single one of my classes and jobs to level 60, a feat that I'm sure very few people have had the time and patience to accomplish yet. But while that's all good and exciting, what I really wanted to do was, once I had this achieved, was to talk about each and every job currently in the game, and sort of help people who are either new to the game or aren't too informed about the other jobs in the game outside of the one they currently play. Within lulls of content, leveling and trying other jobs is a great thing to occupy your time until the next patch, and you might find yourself enjoying a new job and the change of pace. You might even want to start considering a main change. I think more people should really take advantage of the ability to play every class and job on a single character. Now, I do want to stress that I am not an expert on every single job. I have, though, taken the time to understand the mechanics of each job, and I've leveled each from 1 to 60, or in the case of the 3 new jobs, 30 to 60, and I believe that I have at least an intermediate level of mastery over each job. A lot of what I say will be my own personal opinion, but my main goal is to try and interest you and inform you of the strengths and weaknesses of each job, and to get you to expand your roster. Being able to change to a different job can really help counter the monotony of things, and can be a nice refresher at times when things just seem dull. First, I'd like to go over the 3 roles each job falls under. There's the DPS, the tank, and the healer role. Let's start with the DPS role. The DPS role is the most popular and has the most variety and number in terms of jobs to pick from. Your main role is simple: do damage. In any party composition, DPS will also be the most numerous, meaning that there will always be more DPS than there are tanks and healers. This essentially puts less stress on each DPS individually, simply because there are more of you to spread the responsibilities around, making this a common role choice for beginners. Now, this does not mean you don't have to work as hard, or that your role is any less difficult. It only means it is easier for your mistakes and shortcomings to go unnoticed, and for the other DPS in your party to carry you if you are falling behind. This makes it even more crucial for you to be honest in your own self-evaluation, and to realize where mistakes and shortcomings are your fault, so that you can improve as a player. DPS jobs can further be split into melee and ranged DPS subcategories. Melee DPS are right in the heat of the action, needing to be in close proximity to their targets to deal maximum damage. Because of this, they must also be aware of their position and any close range attacks the boss may perform. They also have the added mechanic of positional attacks that need to be dealt from a specific side of an enemy for maximum damage. Because of their need to be close to enemies, they are usually the last to be considered for movement intensive mechanics, opting for the ranged DPS to handle those. Melee DPS's single target damage tends to be higher than ranged DPS as well, although their AoE damage in comparison to ranged DPS is pretty lackluster. Ranged DPS can deal the majority of their damage from a distance, and can be further split into caster and physical ranged DPS. Caster DPS have well-rounded damage in both single target and AoE scenarios, and come equipped with interesting utilities to aid the party. As their name suggests though, they require a lot of time to spend casting their abilities, so while their range is mobile, they shouldn't be moving around too frequently. Physical ranged have the weakest DPS output, but have the ability to move around freely while doing most of their damage, and when they don't need to utilize their high mobility potential, they can turn on a semi-caster stance that adds cast time to their abilities, although these cast times are shorter than the traditional caster and still allow good mobility in between abilities with some mastery. Physical range DPS are considered as a heavy support role, having a wide variety of buffs and utility, some of which are used with the sacrifice of their own personal DPS. And while on paper their DPS output is lower than the other DPS types, they can still pull great DPS with good mastery, and they help sustain the party's resources in longer fights, making them an extremely valuable asset of any party. Let's talk about tanks now. As a tank, your overall role is simple: hold the attention of enemies so that your DPS and healers can properly fulfill their roles. Meanwhile, you have tools to enhance your survivability, and can help with dealing damage. While basic tanking is pretty simple, many are intimidated by the role and opt to leave it to others. The tank has a built-in leadership role, as they are the ones charging headfirst into the enemy, and they are the ones who set the pace of the entire encounter. They choose what path to take, how many enemies to pull, and it quickly becomes apparent when you have an experienced tank as opposed to a new one. Being a tank definitely requires some confidence, The leading aspect is also what makes people shy away from the role, as they are statistically the least played of the 3 roles. But if you can get past that, you'll find tanking to not be nearly as difficult as most think it is, and it is always a great experience to have a reliable tank in your party. And the healer role, which if you followed my channel, you'll know this is the role I primarily specialize in. The role of a healer is to keep the party alive and well from any detrimental effects. As you can imagine, healers are supporters of the party, having a variety of utilities from defense to offense. They can also output decent DPS when given the opportunity. Healers are the most difficult role as they have the most responsibility of any other party member. They have to deal with unpredictability more so than the other roles, and is the least consistent in terms of how you deal with each fight, as each encounter of the same fight can differ drastically depending on the performance of your party. No other role has the potential to carry players as well as healers can, but having a capable healer at your side can be a wonderful experience. Now that we've talked briefly about each role, we should dive into the overviews of each job, starting with the DPS. Remember that these are my own personal opinions formed from actually playing each of them to level 60, as well as talking with others who main some of these other jobs I don't play as often. Firstly, the Dragoon. The Dragoon is the premier job of Heavensward simply because they are dragon killers, and in the expansion about a war against dragons, it just goes without saying the power of the Dragoon symbolizes. The Dragoon has had a very long and gradual evolution from its first implementation in 2.0, where it was a highly flawed melee DPS job. From strict positional requirements that would not grant buffs or trigger combos if not done from the correct side, to long animation lock abilities that would cut into global cooldowns and easily get players stuck in avoidable damage areas if timed badly. Over time, the Dragoon steadily improved until we have its current incarnation now as a solid melee DPS, capable of high DPS, with some small party-wide damage increases built into some of their abilities, such as a wide party-wide critical hit rate increase and a piercing debuff that increases physical range DPS. The Dragoon's rotation is fairly simple and straightforward, and it is not too difficult to learn as you level and receive abilities that just continue to build and expand on your rotation without really altering the placement of any one skill, making it a great choice for beginners to looking into starting out as a DPS. With the inclusion of the new abilities gained from the expansion, the Dragoon has been given a new job mechanic to master, which is a common theme among all of the jobs that we'll be seeing soon. This gives Dragoons a buff to maintain, using a 4th tier combo abilities to extend their new buff. These 4th tier combos have an interesting mechanic, as there are only 2, both of which do the same damage if done from the correct side, but with different positional requirements that will proc randomly whenever finishing a 3rd tier combo ability. This makes Dragoon a bit more movement intensive since before the expansion, but it really isn't too difficult of a learning curve, and one should be able to get the hang of this RNG 4th tier ability fairly quickly. Overall, the Dragoon is a solid melee DPS with some complexity, but it isn't all too difficult to learn and can be a good job for beginners as it builds upon a simple foundation at a very gradual pace. The Monk is the second melee DPS originally implemented in 2.0, rivaling the Dragoon as a job that hits with smaller attacks but with a much greater speed. The Monk has actually changed very little since before the expansion, only gaining some abilities to use in between global cooldowns, as well as some abilities to use to help maintain their buffs and prep their abilities outside of combat. The mastery of the Monk comes from its movement intensive playstyle, as all but one of their main weapon skills has a positional requirement, as well as the upkeep of their Greased Lightning buff that increases their damage and attack speed. As I mentioned before, the Monk is a very fast paced and there's a lot of switching from flank to rear in order to maximize damage. The Monk has to build up their power gradually, but once they've peaked, it becomes a very fast and fun experience to maintain that power. The potency of their attacks are actually very low compared to other jobs, but they have various buffs and debuffs to increase their effectiveness, making and maintaining all of these buffs and debuffs are extremely important. The downfall of the Monk is combat inactivity, as doing so will cause all of their power to fade, forcing them to build it back up again once they have something to attack. The expansion has thankfully given monks some interesting tools to use to help with this, including an ability that helps them switch forms outside of combat, an ability that allows them to build stacks for either a powerful attack or a TP restore, an ability that allows them to completely expend their valuable Greased Lightning buff for a powerful attack, when it is completely impossible to maintain the increased lightning due to a certain mechanic or phase shift. Overall, the monk is arguably contains the highest single target DPS in terms of individual damage, but aside from party-wide healing buff and an ability that reduces an enemy's outgoing magic damage, it doesn't have very many interesting utilities for the party like the other DPS can provide. But this should not detract you from playing the monk if it interests you, because a good monk can absolutely destroy when it comes to damage. The monk is personally my favorite among the 3 melee DPS. Its high damage and fast playstyle can be quite addicting. Ninja was originally implemented in 2.4, and similar to the monk, its overall playstyle hasn't changed much since then, as the majority of their new abilities are used off of the global cooldown, as well as one alternate choice for ending their 3-part combo. The ninja is very similar to the monk in that it possesses an attack speed buff that must be maintained. However, the ninja's personal DPS is arguably the lowest of the 3 melee DPS, instead bring a variety of interesting party utilities, such as an ability that increases an enemy's vulnerability for a short time, effectively increasing the entire party's damage, a TP restore used on a single party member, a slashing debuff which can increase tank damage, and enmity tools that can be used in unique situations to ease and clean up some tricky encounters. The ninja's most unique mechanic is their ninjutsu system, which gives them access to 3 different mudra, which will produce a different ninjutsu ability depending on the sequence you enter in your mudra. These ninjutsu abilities can range from a self buff to attack speed, single target and AoE damage, and a bind attack. However, this adds an interesting learning curve as it requires the memorization of the correct sequence of mudra to get each ability that you may want. Also, the ninja can suffer greatly from bad latency and lag, making it a difficult choice to play for those who play with a less than stellar internet connection. Overall though, it is a highly sought out job for the party utility, and a good ninja should always be welcome into any party. The Black Mage is one of the most recognizable figures in the Final Fantasy series, and one of the most popular jobs to play among Final Fantasy XIV's player base. It is a traditional caster having a turret playstyle that requires them to be very minimal in their movement in order to deal their maximum damage. The main mechanic behind the job is the balance between their Astral Fire stance, which allows them to deal more damage, and their Umbral Ice stance, which allows them to regain their MP at an insanely fast rate. With this, Black Mages are never in need of MP if played correctly. With the inclusion of their Heavensward abilities, the Black Mage has been given an Enochian buff that increases overall damage that can be refreshed using a 4th tier Blizzard spell. Because of this new Enochian buff, the single target rotation of a Black Mage has now become extremely strict, and a mistake in timing or inability to stand still to get off proper spells casted can result in a large damage loss. However, the allure of the Black Mage is strong. Aside from single target damage, it has really good AoE damage, utilities to slow and heavy targets, sleep multiple targets, and reduce magic damage taken by a party member, and overall it can be quite satisfying to see your big explosions and large numbers from all your spells. It really allows you as the player to feel the impact and power of your job, which isn't something that other jobs do nearly as well. Overall, the Black Mage is a great choice for those looking for a traditional caster to play. The Summoner is one of 2 jobs in the game to have a pet to follow them into battle. It is unique to every other job in the game, as it is the only to share a base class with another job, the Scholar, and leveling one will in turn level the other. This, however, causes the 2 to share the 35 attribute points that you get to allocate to a main stat as you level up, which has caused some headache ever since its implementation in 2.0. But this is a technicality we are not here to discuss. The Summoner's playstyle relies heavily on the usage of damage over time effects, their Aetherflow stack usage, and proper control of and use of their pet and their actions. Because of this, a lot of their damage can sometimes be hard to really see or feel, which is nearly the opposite of Black Mage's feel. But the Summoner can apply great damage if played properly, and their damage over time effects can melt through bosses or multiple enemies. They have access to 3 different pets, although only their melee and caster pet are viable in the majority of dungeons and fights. Prior to Heavensward, it was also a very resource-starved job, running low on MP in long drawn-out fights. In the expansion, while there are no changes to their actual abilities, Summoners instead get a considerable increase to their MP pool with each level beyond level 50. Their Heavensward abilities give them more tools for inflicting AoE damage, as well as a new Dreadworm stance that can be used once their 3 Aether stacks have been used. And as I mentioned before, they share a base class with the healer job, so they can bring some pretty useful utility that is built into their base class, including the ability to raise a dead party member in combat, the only non-healer capable of doing so. Overall, the Summoner is one of the most complex jobs in the game, requiring the mastery of their pets, their damage over time application and upkeep, and the proper use of their 8th flow abilities to maximize damage. And it definitely pays off to be a great summoner, as you'll excel in both single target and AoE damage. The Bard is a physical range DPS that is capable of high mobility and party support. As a Bard leveling, your combat complexity is fairly simple, working with the application of damage over time effects and a small priority system of abilities. But as you make your way into the expansion, you'll find a huge playstyle change waiting for you that has really pushed former bards away from the job, and that is centered around the Wanderer's Minuet ability, a stance which halts your auto attacks, increases your damage, and adds short cast times to most of your weapon skills, essentially turning you into a semi-caster. The cast time of your abilities actually does not take up your entire global cooldown, allowing you about a second of free movement in between each attack. But still, the point of the matter is that this ability does increase the bard's damage, but also greatly removes its high mobility that many people have learned to enjoy about the job. However, if you can master and get past this playstyle change, or if it does not bother you, the bard is an extremely important part of any party. While their damage will always be slightly lower than what all the other DPS are capable of, the bard has the ability to use their MP to sing songs to either reduce the magical resistance of all nearby enemies, or to restore the TP or MP of all party members nearby at the cost of their own damage. This ability to extend the longevity of the party's resources makes them invaluable in any raid composition. With the change of playstyle, the rarity of decent bards has increased since the expansion. Aside from learning how to master the cast times of Wanderer's Minuet and knowing when to sing your support songs, the bard is a fairly simple job in terms of combat, and a good choice for beginners. The bard is also my own personal favorite DPS to play. The Machinist is the final DPS in the game, and the new DPS job to be added in the expansion. Because of this, you must obviously have the expansion purchased and have a character that has progressed through patch 2.55 story in order to unlock it. It is a physical range DPS similar to the Bard that utilizes a turret and an interesting RNG combo system. The combo system is similar to how melee jobs combo their abilities, using a first tier combo to proc the second and so on. However, the Machinist only has a 50% chance to proc the next combo ability by default, but can use ammo stacks from some of their other abilities to force 100% procs and slightly increase the potency of their attacks. The combo system isn't exactly difficult to understand, but it can be rather frustrating when your combos don't flow and you become stuck spamming your first combo ability over and over again. But Machinists also have the inclusion of their turret, a single target and an AoE proximity turret that you can position and place down. Once you place it down, you can practically forget about it, because unlike the summoner and their pet, you have very little ways of interacting with your turret, as it will simply attack whatever you are attacking, and beyond pressing a few buttons to change its functionality, there is no other interaction with the turret. This can be a negative or a positive thing depending on your personal view of how much control you'd like over your companion, and the summoner already fulfills a very involved role. As for the Machinist, there are actually very little buttons to press in terms of combat, very much like the Bard. Most of their abilities are party utilities, although many of them are either or abilities that share the same cooldowns. This makes Machinist extremely condensed, which can also be seen as a negative or positive thing. But regardless, they have access to very good utilities, including promoting their turret to do a TP or MP restore instead of attack, a physical or magical resistance down on enemies, a physical or magical damage down from an enemy dealt, a silence, a stun, a bind, a heavy. The Machinist is basically a jack of all trades when it comes down to utility. Unfortunately, this makes them feel somewhat weak in identity, as they just seem a lot like a summoner and a bard hybrid with many support capabilities. But that is not to say that this makes this job bad, because it is a great substitute for a bard slot in a raid composition. I just personally feel like they could have done something a lot more interesting with the Machinist. but as it is now, it functions perfectly as a second range DPS job. And that's all 7 of the DPS jobs. And now let's dive into the leaders of the party, the tanks. The Paladin. Now, the Paladin has been the subject of many jokes around the community for its very simplistic combat capability, which basically consisted of a single 3-part enmity combo with some other global cooldowns with niche abilities, such as a pacification, a stun, or an MP restore. The expansion moved to widen the Paladin's combat effectiveness with 2 new DPSing combos to use when enmity is not an issue. But the Paladin itself is not about their damage output as much as it is about its unbeatable durability and defense as a tank. The Paladin is unrivaled in damage mitigation, having a variety of great defensive cooldowns, as well as the ability to use their MP to shield, stone skin, and heal themselves and their party members. That being said, the Paladin's combat is very simple and can be boring for some players. They also have the worst AoE damage out of any job in the game, possessing only one AoE ability that sits on a 25-second cooldown. But while their damage may not be able to rival the other 2 tanks, it is still a great and well-made job, and one of the best designed jobs in the game now, I feel. But if you can handle the pressure and responsibility of being a tank, it can be a great stepping stone for new players or players looking into tanking for the first time. The Warrior is a tank about soaking damage with a higher HP pool and having tools to both self-heal and receive larger heals from spell-based healing. The Warrior is capable of being extremely aggressive in DPS output, making many legitimately forget that the Warrior is actually a tank job and not a DPS. The Warrior does not actually take any less damage while in their tanking stance, only gaining a slightly higher HP pool and receiving increased healing. Because of this, they can seamlessly switch in between their tank and DPS stances to maximize the capabilities of both stances. This requires a high mastery, but the results can be extremely satisfying. The core mechanic of the Warrior allows them to build stacks from using their various abilities to gain access to a set of abilities that cost no TP and all have great effects depending on which stance you're currently in, tank or DPS stance. Add in the fact that you have the option to use one of your cooldowns as a TP restore, and the Warrior is easily one of the best self-sustaining jobs in the game. Because of the high level of mastery to play the job properly, it can be easy to play the job inefficiently, and the skill of warriors you'll encounter can range from terrible to amazing. But having a capable warrior in your party can be a great feeling as you see them just tear through enemies alongside you with their high damage. If you think tanking is boring, you should try warrior before you give up on it, because you might just fall in love with it. The warrior is personally my favorite among the 3 tanks to play, and is probably one of the best jobs in the game currently. Dark Knight is a new tank added in the expansion. Again, you must have the expansion and have progressed through patch 2.55 story in order to unlock this job. The Dark Knight has a good middle ground between the 2 tanks, possessing decent defensive cooldowns, but not as good as the Paladins, and having decent DPS output, but not as good as the Warriors. However, the main mechanic is their management of their MP, and its use in their various abilities. A Dark Knight's MP is always constantly draining, and it becomes a battle to both use their MP to be more effective, as well as to constantly restore it as so to not run out. This mechanic can be very distracting as a part of the job, and it often causes people still learning the job to fall short on their actual role of tanking, as they become too focused on their MP draining too fast. However, with some practice it does become easier to maintain your MP, and you can begin focusing on the job itself, which is fairly well rounded. They can reduce the magical damage of enemies and possess defensive abilities similar to the Paladin. The tanking and DPS stances can also be active simultaneously, making their DPS output while in their tanking stance respectable if played properly. However, there are several of their abilities that can only be utilized while tanking, which can be frustrating being unable to use them if in the off-tank role. Overall, however, the Dark Knight is a perfectly capable tank, but its flaws remain in its MP managing, which can be distracting and can sometimes feel like a lot more work and effort to get similar results in terms of tanking and damage as the other 2 tanks. And finally, we can move on to the healers, which is the role I'm most known for and familiar with. The White Mage is the more traditional healer of the 3, having a wide variety of spells and abilities to increase their healing effectiveness. Out of the 3 healers, it is the best actual healer. What I mean by that is that it is the best at restoring people's HP bars, and in content that calls for 2 healers, the bulk of the healing will usually fall upon the White Mage. One thing to note is that the White Mage's base healing class, the Conjurer, is the only healing class available to start a character as, and it is the only healing class with a level 1 to 30 experience, as both of the other healers are unlocked and start at level 30. The White Mage is a fairly straightforward job, possessing little in terms of complexity, but that does not mean it is an easy job to play properly. A lot of the White Mage's role boils down to choosing the right healing spells for the situation, and to manage and conserve your MP to last the length of the fight. If you're looking to try healing, this is the best place to start, especially considering that you can't even unlock the other 2 healers until later on. Up until the expansion, this job has been my main role, but I now play in here alongside my Astrologian. The Scholar is a healing class that has the support of a healing fairy to aid them in battle. This job shares a base class with Summoner, and leveling one will also level the other, as well as sharing the 35 attribute points you'll gain as you level up. The Scholar is a very complex job and one of the more difficult to master. It has a huge array of utilities, from damage reduction to shield healing to increased attack speed buffs for the party. It has less healing spells than the White Mage, but has a lot of healing abilities, many of which must be used carefully with their Aether Flow stacks, which they are allowed 3 of each minute. One of its advantages is its Faerie, which allows them to heal 2 targets at once if they command their Faerie properly. The Faerie itself also has an infinite pool of MP and heals, so as long as they are kept safe and alive throughout the fight. Scholars are well known for their high DPS capability, possessing many of the same basic DPS skills that the Summoner has, and having the freedom to DPS and heal with their Faerie simultaneously. Of course, this makes Scholar a very delicate job to play, as it soon becomes easy to become absorbed in dealing damage to actually fulfill their healing responsibilities. There is a high level of skill and mastery that goes not only into healing, but also managing their pet Faerie, but also making use of their DPS potential all at once. However, because of this potential, Scholars are one of the most powerful jobs in the game, and a great support healer to any party. And finally, we have the Astrologian, the newest healer added into the game, with the expansion and my personal favorite of the 3 healers. To access it, you must complete patch 2.55 story and have the expansion purchased. The Astrologian is unique in the fact that it can choose to either specialize in healing over time or shield effects. It also has a variety of healing spells, but not nearly as versatile at healing as the White Mage is. The Astrologian's main mechanic is their Divining Deck, which allows them to draw from a deck of 6 different cards that can aid and support themselves or their party members with increased damage, reduced damage taken, increased attack speed, reduced ability cooldowns, or a TP or MP regen. Many of their abilities are centered around their cards, which in turn takes away from their healing capabilities and makes them slightly less effective healers than the other 2. However, their support can be a blessing to any party, and the only factor being that it is completely chance and RNG which cards are drawn. Some runs can provide great cards, with other runs producing many subpar uses for the cards that they end up drawing. The overall RNG is what gates the power of some of their cards, and it is what makes the Astrologian an exciting job to play, as you draw different cards and decide how you want to use them. It is a shame that their healing potential suffers for all of their focus on their cards, but they are still perfectly fine healers capable of healing all content in the game if played by the right people. And now, I've talked about and given my overviews of all 13 jobs currently in the game. Crafters and Gatherers I'm not very experienced with, so I'll leave that to other people. Hopefully you're entertained by what I had to say about each job, and are maybe intrigued to try a few of them out to widen your variety in gameplay. If you'd like to ask me further questions on more specific details on certain jobs, feel free to leave a comment and I'll answer to the best of my ability. Keep in mind that I am not a master of all of these jobs, but others who do know these jobs better than I do can also reply to you, and hopefully we can all have some nice discussions together. Anyways, my name is Tsuki, and I hope you all enjoyed this video. Be sure to subscribe if you're interested in more content like this. I'll see you all again next time. Bye bye.